And with us now to talk about the issues that the deaf and blind of Minnesota face, we have with us on our panel John Benson. John is the Deputy Director of Program Services for the Minnesota Department of Economic Development. And from the Minnesota Department of Human Services, we have a deaf and hard of hearing specialist, Sarah Kreiling, and with the interpreter, Ann Jankla. So thanks to all of you for joining us on Compass.
It's a pleasure.
John, I'd like to start with you if I could. We hear a lot about the differences in services between rural and urban areas in Minnesota. So in your field of expertise, how are the services different for people in rural areas?
The issue really comes down to a couple of primary aspects for rural Minnesota compared to metro. That is transportation, and typically it's the lack of effective transportation, and then work opportunity. Both of those are a very significant barrier to people who are blind, visually impaired, and deafblind to be able to not only access services but also to engage in the community and engage in employment, which is really what we're designed to do.
So in other words, let's say if someone is in Minneapolis, they might have an easy access to a Metro Transit bus from point A to point B, whereas in rural areas that's a much tougher issue.
It's significantly tougher. A lot of folks can utilize public transportation, whether it's the train system, bus system, the Uber method. In greater Minnesota, it really is a challenge. And when you have those smaller communities and you have folks isolated in a sense in those rural areas, it can be really hard to not only deliver services, but also for those individuals to move into an area where they can actually achieve an employment outcome.
Okay. Yeah. And Sarah, I'll ask you the same question for the people that you work with. You know, how are the differences in services different between rural and urban areas?
Yes, I think that Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services has faced the same challenges as State Services for the Blind. Transportation is very difficult, especially also with our staff traveling to meet with consumers as well. So providing services in greater Minnesota compared with the metro area is definitely a challenge. Technology has certainly helped out with access to the community more in rural areas, so that is a positive side of greater Minnesota as well.
Could you expand on that a little bit in terms of the technology and how that has helped?
Certainly. For many deaf-blind individuals, those who have both a combined hearing and vision loss, and also seniors who are hard of hearing who may also have a vision loss, we've seen technology help them to connect more with their communities, connect more to access to resources that may be available to them. And one of the big things is video phones. If you've ever experienced video phones, that certainly has been easier to help staff to, quote unquote, visit clients through video screens. So it does make it easier to connect with individuals and also to find resources using that technology. And there's other people who are available to support these individuals in the community if they feel they need support services. They may have access to find people who can support them through that technology. Also finding interpreters as well. A lot of people who communicate in sign language want to be able to communicate in that language, and it may be hard for them to find others who communicate in that way living in greater Minnesota and in rural areas.
And so this touches on the area of broadband access then as well, because if people are talking about video phones and those kinds of accesses, I assume we run across individuals who might have limited access to the services because they don't have access to the basic technology to reach the service.
Exactly, yeah. There are still some areas around greater Minnesota that don't have access or not enough access to that high-speed internet. I assume that people with blindness are experiencing the same challenges. There are some areas that don't have fast enough internet services in order to use this technology to their full potential.
So while the technology is clearly helping, you know, that's one trend. But I'd like to ask you, John, start with you. What are some other trends that we're seeing that are changing the accessibility of services?
Well, there's a definite aspect that has to do with our funding in terms of what are our resources like, and how much can we deliver with those resources. we certainly want to maximize as much as we can the things that we do, and we're always looking for efficiencies. But, for example, in Greater Minnesota, State Services for the Blind probably has about 12 what we would call vocational rehabilitation staff positioned around the state in different workforce centers. That's a way that we can begin to filter out into the communities and get out into the field more. But at the same time, we have, for example, one staff in Hutchinson, and he serves the greater southwestern portion of the state. And so that's a lot of travel time, that's a lot of windshield time, and it's very hard to be a little bit more effectively efficient with that kind of travel demands on him.
And Sarah, for your work, a similar sort of resource issue or resource challenge in terms of distances and time?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The funding for sure, but there is definitely a lot of travel, and also during the winter time it's a lot harder to keep those services going because of the weather, and we have to do all of this traveling. So I know that's where technology has certainly helped, where we can access those services via video phone and whatnot. Okay. And certainly it does help the clients not having to wait as long for staff to see them if they are able to use the video phone or something like that. Otherwise they have to wait for those staff to be available to come to them.
Okay. When people first start to look at needing to access services, I suppose they often don't know where to start. So I'd like to talk about what are some of the places where people can start when they believe that they need to access services or help others access services. So Sarah, if I could start with you on this one.
A lot of people don't know where to start. That's very true. You know, where do we begin the process? And they also don't know what's available to them, the technology that may be available, the apps that might be available, the resources. So certainly contacting our office, Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services has 5 regional offices around Greater Minnesota. We can provide information and referral. We can provide direct assistance. We can provide mental health counseling. We also have a telephone equipment distribution program for people with hearing loss. So certainly contact our offices and we can refer people to the appropriate locations and walk through any issues that they may need. We also serve people who, like I said, have hearing loss issues, not just deaf-blind individuals, but for people who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf-blind, especially senior citizens who have lost their hearing later on in life and possibly their vision as well. They can certainly start with our agency. We serve any age group, anyone who has a hearing loss, and then those who have the combined hearing and vision loss.
And John, for your agency?
You know, we've for a long time considered ourselves to have been one of the best kept secrets in the state of Minnesota, that State Services for the Blind exists. It is one of those things where there's a constant effort to market and get the word out. We know that many of the folks we work with, particularly in Greater Minnesota, are coming to us by word of mouth, either because of the work that our own staff does, or in some cases it's community members or community agencies as well that we've interacted with. We have, fortunately, we have a radio talking book program that does cover the state of Minnesota. And in many respects, that helps us as far as getting our word out as well. But that seems to be an ongoing challenge, is how do we get those people who need to know that we're here and could utilize our services to know that. And so it's a step-by-step process.
And since you mentioned Radio Talking Book, for the benefit of our viewers who aren't familiar, they can receive a radio that is set to a particular frequency, and then they can have everything from the daily newspaper to books that they can hear 24 hours a day, correct?
That is correct. It's 24/7, 365 days a year, and it's a free service for those people who are able to utilize it, and it is one of those things that we'll do a plug. It was invented here in the state of Minnesota, so once again, Minnesota innovation at hand.
Yeah, it's a wonderful program. I know people who have taken advantage of that, so yeah, you're right, and it is a well-kept secret.
It is, unfortunately.
Yeah. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'd like to talk a bit about some outreach from your offices, and again, ways that other people can learn more and gain access to services that they perhaps did not know were available. So, Sarah, I'd like to start with you on this one.
Okay, well, for outreach services, we try to do our best, but it is a challenge finding people who need those services, of course. How do we find them? We try to go to different vendors in the communities. We have a Deaf Awareness Fair, and that's how we reach others. We can go into nursing homes, libraries. We do as much as we can to try and find the people that we need to utilize our services. Of course, technology helps with that as well because it's easier to find more people that way, also by word of mouth. We do have a website that people can visit if they want more information on our agency as well.
Okay. And that's, as we close this out, I want to talk about websites a bit. So, John, the website that people could go to for more information on your services?
mnssb.org.
So mnssb.org, and SSB, of course, stands for State Services for the Blind.
That is correct.
Okay. And for your agency?
Yeah, our website actually has just changed recently, but if you Google it, you can find it easily if you Google Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services Minnesota. So there are many video clips that people can watch to learn about deaf blindness, how to be a support service provider for deafblind individuals. That's a good way to start, and it is easy to find our agency through Google.
Well, and I would expect also in the cases of both of your agencies, many people find you through local social service providers or physicians or nurses, and I expect for both of you that's where many people start, right?
That's true.
Because they would be well aware of your services.
That's the expectation.
Okay.
Hopefully, yes.
All right, great. With that, we are out of time. So John Benson and Sarah Kreiling, thank you very much for joining us this week on Compass.
Thank you.
And that's all for this week on this topic and how rural areas are affected. Our Compass producer, Laura K. Prosser, will take it from here and end this week's episode with the next installment of the Compass Literature Corner. Thanks for watching.